thank you all for coming and joining us this morning. We're gonna, like Ann said, we're gonna try and get through stuff pretty quickly here, but at any point, if you've got questions, feel free to either enter them in the chat or just pause me. I'll try not to speak too quickly, but try to get through it all as well. So, whoa, there we go. So I always like to start with a couple definitions just to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. Especially when it comes to immigration and refugee resettlement, a lot of terms are thrown around in pop culture and in the media, and they're not always used correctly. So I like to make sure that we're all coming from the same understanding when we're starting a conversation. So I start with a definition for immigrant, which is a broad umbrella term. It is a migrant or an immigrant is someone who, it's really a generic term for someone who's moved from one country to another with the intention of staying in that country for some minimum period of time. So tourists or business visitors are not included in the definition of immigrant, but it does include people like permanent temporary migrants, people with a valid residence permit or a valid visa, as well as people who are seeking asylum and undocumented migrants as well. Then we go into the term asylum seeker or asylee. That's one that we've heard a lot over the past several years, especially, and it's someone who's fled their home.
Available.
They have entered a country and either intending to formally submit or have already formally submitted a request for legal protection and material assistance, but their claim hasn't been processed or judged yet. So it's someone who's fled, come into the United States in our context, and while they're here, they're seeking protection, but that claim for status hasn't yet been adjudicated. So they're still kind of in this legal limbo. Then we narrow it down to a refugee, who is someone who has fled their homes. They're outside of his or her home country. They're unable to return home as a result of a well-founded fear of persecution based on these set definitions of a race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group or political opinion. So it's a really solid definition of a refugee. It's very clear cut that it's someone who belongs to some group of the population based on one of these areas. And then they, because of that membership, they're being persecuted. The difference between a refugee and an asylee or asylum seeker is that refugees have fled into another country. They submit an application. We'll talk about that process in a little bit. And then they wait overseas for their claim to be adjudicated. Whereas asylees, in our context again, enter the United States and are waiting here for their context to be, for that process to be adjudicated. So with all of these, it's really important to remember that they're all terms that are defined in immigration law. And like I said, they're often misrepresented in the media. So it's important to make sure we understand that distinction. So at this point, I usually like to let people tell their own stories about what an immigrant is, or so you can hear it from their own voices. Those are the videos that I put in the chat. So the first one in the chat is, and I never remember how to say his name correctly, but William's story is the first one in the chat. William, his mother came to the United States seeking better economic opportunity. And later on, his brothers and sisters came to join his mother. So we hear in William's story how they came to the US seeking opportunity. And so they would be defined as a migrant or an immigrant. Then we have Cecilia is the second story that I put in the chat box. Cecilia comes from Burma and from the Karen state in Burma. Her and her family were being persecuted in Burma, and so they fled into Thailand. And in Thailand, then the camp that they were staying in was attacked by a number of different militia groups. And so we hear about the fear and the persecution and pain that caused Cecilia's family to flee into the United States eventually. So again, I'd like to provide a little bit of context to how we got to where we are for the resettlement program and how it's grown and evolved over the years. So taking it back a little over 100 years now, in the aftermath of World War I, we know that millions of people fled their homes seeking safety. At that point, and up until that point, governments would respond to these kind of crises by drawing up a set of international agreements that would provide travel documents for people fleeing their homes. By World War II, the numbers of people fleeing their homes had increased dramatically, and millions of more people were displaced. At that point, the US really led the assistance and reconstruction efforts to help displaced people. In the aftermath of World War II, the US admitted 250,000 displaced Europeans who were unable to return home. And by 1948, Congress passed what's called the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, which provided for an additional 400,000 European refugees to enter into the United States. That was also the same year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the United Nations. One of the articles of that Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. And that point is really when we started to see the codification of immigration law, of refugee law. And so we started to see the international community recognize that this was something that needed to be dealt with in a really concerted group effort from nations around the world. So in an effort to formalize the protection of that basic right and help the Europeans that were still displaced by 1950, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, was established. They were initially tasked with helping 1 million refugees, who were mainly European citizens at that point, return home or find some kind of durable solution. They were given 3 years to complete that work and then tasked with disbanding. However, just a year into their work in 1951, they held a diplomatic convention in Geneva called the Convention Relating to the Status of Refugees. And that point, they realized this was not something that we can solve in a year, and we need to continue this work. And so that 1951 convention set the international definition of a refugee as someone who's been forced to flee their home based on a well-founded fear of persecution. Fast forward a handful of years, 1967, we see Vietnam, Southeast Asia becoming increasingly unstable, and a number of people fleeing their homes in that area. At that point, the definition of a refugee was expanded beyond just European citizens uprooted because of World War II to include anyone, anywhere in the world who's fled their home based on a well-founded fear of persecution. Between the 1967 convention and the 1951 convention, those two clearly laid out the definition of a refugee, the types of legal protection and other assistance, as well as social rights that refugees are entitled to receive. And it also defines refugees' obligations to their host countries. It defines who can and cannot receive refugee status. So categories like war criminals are ineligible to receive a refugee status. And that really solidified internationally the definition. However, the US was still operating on an ad hoc basis. In 1975, a call was put out to the governors across the United States requesting them to resettle a group of Vietnamese refugees called the Thai Dam, an ethnic group of refugees who really have a tight-knit community and wanted to stay together. There was only one governor that responded to that request, and that was Iowa's Governor Robert Ray. He said that we have the moral obligation to help people and that Iowa has the space and the ability to provide that assistance. And so Iowa then became the largest resettlement location for the Thai Dam and really paved the way for resettlement services across the country. Because of that 1975 experience of trying to request assistance from governors, in 1980, Congress passed the Refugee Act of 1980, which incorporated that UN definition into US law. defining who is a refugee, and really worked to standardize the resettlement services for all refugees that would be resettled into the United States, regardless of what state or locality they were resettled into. It provided that legal basis. And then over the next couple decades, the 1980s, 1990s, and even into the 2000s, we continued to perfect the system. The US continued to expand its obligations to protect vulnerable and displaced people. And today, the process is that every year, the President of the United States consults with Congress and other federal agencies to determine the nationalities and different processing priorities for refugees that will be admitted to the United States in that upcoming year. So resettlement programs operate on a federal fiscal year because of that presidential determination. The president in that determination also sets the annual ceiling for the number of refugees who can enter the US. This past year, the presidential determination was set at 15,000. In the past, it's been set as high as 75, 100, even up to 125,000 refugees. We are hopeful with the new administration that we will see increasing numbers in the coming years. However, we know that there's an infrastructure of overseas processing, of statewide or stateside resettlement networks that have been really challenged over the past 4 years. And so there's a lot of rebuilding that needs to be done. With that, there today are about 9 national resettlement agencies, and they have approximately 200 local resettlement sites that help refugees resettle into local communities. All of those national agencies and our local sites like Catherine McAuley Center have a cooperative agreement or a contract with the Department of State that outlines exactly what services are required to be provided, what the time frame for those services are, and what assistance we are required to provide in resettling and supporting refugees. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit, but where we are today, today we're witnessing some of the highest levels of displacement on record. There's an unprecedented over 70 million people who have been forced to flee their homes for a number of different reasons. Of that, about 41 million are internally displaced people. So that's someone who has been forced to flee their home and their locality that they're from and flee into a different area. We know that in a number of different countries, borders were drawn very arbitrarily. And so someone who flees perhaps the Karen state in Burma into one of the Chin state, it's a different language, a very different culture, different experiences. And so internally displaced people face additional challenges that aren't faced by many of the other, many people who flee into other areas, largely because they don't receive as much support as they would if they fled into a different country. However, they know they want to stay home. I've heard people tell me that your home is like your mother and no one wants to leave your mother. So there's that kind of push and pull internally and with people trying to figure out what is best for their safety. Then again, of that over 70 million, about 26 million of them are refugees who are waiting resettlement into a third country. And then about 3.5 million are asylum seekers. On the graphic, you can see some other statistics. All of this is pulled from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees website. So if you are curious about any of this information or want to learn more, I highly encourage you to go to unhcr.org. They've got some wonderful information. I could get lost in their website for hours just reading everything they've got. So today in the world, one person is forced to flee their home every 2 seconds as a result of conflict or persecution. So with that, we'll go to the video that Anne was mentioning. I do like to preface this, it can be a little bit unsettling. It can feel heartbreaking. It's a poem that was written based on interviews with refugees about what they took when they fled their homes. It really gives you that opportunity to understand the different experiences and the things that are going through people's minds, as well as kind of what they're valuing when they're fleeing their homes. For some people, fleeing the process of flight can take can happen very quickly. For others, it's a long, drawn-out decision that they have to make. So we'll let the poem and the images speak for themselves. I will say, if you are someone who's experienced instability in your life, if you're someone who has been forced to flee your home for any reason, or if you've been through these kind of traumatic experiences, I will give a little bit of a trigger warning and say that feel free to turn your camera off, mute the video. It's about 5 minutes, so we'll check back in after we listen to the stories.
Wallet.
Empty.
Wallet.
Wallet. Money.
Coins.
Pennies.
Torch.
Whistle. Laser pointer.
Seen more clearly out at sea.
3 bags.
1 bag.
Rucksack.
Trunk.
Yellow plastic bag for paper, sellotape till waterproof.
And yellow cards for refugees.
And national ID.
Army service record.
And an information booklet from the government.
Diploma, electronics.
Certificate from high school.
Passport, if you've got one, you can take.
Expensive one-way ticket.
Fake.
Flag.
Flag. National flag.
Flash drive, laptop, phone.
Mobile.
Phone number, phone number, phone number.
SIM card.
Spare one.
Phone.
Phone.
Smartphone with Skype and FaceTime.
Headphones.
Charger.
Charger.
Overseas adapter.
House keys. House keys. House keys.
We have suffered so much. I want to study so that I can become someone again.
Painkillers.
Painkillers.
Seasickness tablets.
Walking stick.
Walking stick.
White cane.
Crutches.
Wheelchair.
Syringes to use in emergency.
Bandages.
Bandages, toiletries, toothpaste. Toothbrush and toothpaste.
Nail clipper comb.
Shampoo and hair gel. Barber equipment.
And sunscreen.
An ointment for sunburn.
Tablets for son's epilepsy. 1 every day.
And all vaccinations recorded to date for the baby.
And face whitening cream. I want my skin to be white and my hair to be spiked. I don't want them to know I'm a refugee. What if somebody spots me and calls the police? Because I'm illegal. But not if I'm white. That's right, isn't it?
Traditional clothing.
Warm clothing.
Baby clothing.
Favorite clothing.
Dirty clothing.
Wet clothing. Layered clothing.
Pants.
Pants.
Sewing machine. It's my life. It's my blood.
4 dresses.
Change of clothes.
1 pair of flowery jeans that I wore to a party and won't wear again till I go to another one.
1 shirt, 1 shirt, and 1 missing sandal.
Pair of shoes.
Pair of shoes.
New, never worn.
A hijab. A gift from a friend.
My favorite scarf with the skulls on. I just love the color.
My turban. My turban's my guardian. Now it protects my identity and my faith. Without it, I'm vulnerable.
Headscarf from someone who died in the conflict.
A hat for the baby.
And socks for the baby.
1 nappy. Just 1.
And sanitary towels.
Sports jacket for warmth.
And some have a life jacket, too. And some don't.
The most painful thing about being a refugee is that you wake up one day to find you've lost all of your liberty and can no longer decide on your life. It's like everything is closed in your face. So there's nothing else but the sea. There's nothing but the sea. As a way to get out and be free.
Cigarettes.
Carton.
Packet. Lighters.
Clay pipe.
Ginseng.
Jerry can.
Milk.
Sterile water.
Bottled water.
Water, water everywhere.
A half-litre bottle for a 1-week trip.
Bottled oil.
Lemons.
Lemons.
Dates.
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 Dates. Biscuits.
Crackers. Crackers.
Crackers.
Corned beef in a tin.
Tea set for the others on the boat. We're thirsty, tired, and afraid. I'll make some tea. That's what we do. We make a family.
Baby food.
Marshmallows.
Bread that wasn't fully baked, the man who threw us out wouldn't let us finish up.
Metal cooking pot to make some dinner for the children.
1 man only brought a cup.
I'd have been ashamed to ask every day for a cup just to take a drink of water. People get tired of being asked for things all the time, and eventually they will say no. Now, I have my own cup. It gives me independence, no matter where I go.
Plastic carpets.
Rug.
Pillow.
Animal skin tent.
A piece of mortar from the house.
Piece of soil from the garden wrapped in fabric.
Sacred soil.
Sacred books.
Sacred texts.
Rosary and prayer beads.
Rosary.
Prayer beads.
Rosary.
My headdress hides the key to a small metal chest containing all of the essentials for a wedding.
Ring.
Ring.
Charm.
Ring.
Mother's wedding ring. I lost mine in the bombing, so my mother gave me hers.
My earrings. I make jewelry. All the jewelry of my people. It symbolizes freedom. No one tells me what to wear.
Heart necklace.
Heart necklace.
Virgin Mary necklace. Bracelet.
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 No, the bracelet's not my favorite thing. That's Nancy. She's my doll. The night we fled, my mother put her on my bed so we would not forget her.
But in all the rush, she did get left behind.
I don't mind. She'll keep watch.
Watch.
Digital.
And analog.
Family portrait.
Photos.
Photos.
Photo of my father.
Memories of my father. I have nothing from my home. Everything was broken in the struggle. We were out in just 10 minutes. They destroyed the house around my sickbed. The neighbors heard me shout and came and carried me out.
I carried both my children in baskets, swinging from a pole across my shoulders.
And I carried my virginity. Out at sea, we rubbed ourselves in vomit so the pirates wouldn't touch us.
I escaped with my children.
Sister.
Brother.
Husband.
Wife.
With my soul.
With my smile.
With my life.
So you heard in that video the experience of flight can take several days. Sometimes people have time to prepare. You heard mention of things being destroyed around someone living in their home and needing to get out quickly. That process of fleeing, through that, refugees can experience anything from being separated from families, robbery, witnessing torture or killing, losing close family members, enduring harsh environmental conditions. It's a very traumatic experience. So the trauma begins from having to flee and having that fear drive you to have to leave your home. It continues as through the process of fleeing. But perhaps one of the most significant effect from all of the experiences that refugees endure is the feeling of being betrayed, either by their own people, by enemy forces, or by the politics of the world in general. These kind of misanthropic actions really become a major factor in controlling the lives of refugees. And end up having a significant impact on their health and their ability to develop trusting interpersonal relationships, which then are really critical, those trusting relationships, for resettlement as well as healing. After fleeing and being accepted to resettlement in another country, refugees are often resettling in a country that they haven't chosen. They're then forced to adapt to a new place, a new language, under often uncertain conditions. In recent years, as we've seen increasing negativity towards refugees and immigrants, that really compounds that feeling of betrayal and fear and uncertainty. But reestablishing a home and their identity while trying to juggle just those daily tasks of living is another challenge that refugees undertake. So we see all of this compounding in their experience and in the trauma that refugees experience while they're fleeing. So once a refugee has fled their home, they typically will flee into another country. At that point, they'll begin living somewhere while they wait for their case to be adjudicated. Most of us have this image of refugees in a white tent city, and the UNHCR established camps, that picture on the lower left-hand corner of the screen. However, that is the case for many refugees. There are camps in about 40 countries around the world. However, not all refugees live in camps. Over the past about 10 years, we've seen an increasing number of refugees not in the camps, and refugees choosing to live in personal accommodations. And so life in the camps is really regimented for those who choose to live in a camp. They're given what they need. They're provided rations and provided all of the things they need to get by, but they're not allowed to work, and their ability to, they don't have the freedom to leave the camp when they choose. They're just kind of stuck there. And so we know that a lot of dignity comes from being able to provide for yourself, being able to work and earn an income. So many refugees, about 60% of refugees currently, choose to live in personal accommodations, either in transit camps or renting apartments or homes in the countries that they've fled into. However, living in those kind of personal accommodations opens up a door for refugees to be taken advantage of, and often they end up living in subpar housing or overcrowding when they choose that option, because that's the trade-off that they make, and there aren't as many protections in place for refugees who choose to live in personal accommodations. So that provides a little bit of additional context and understanding for why refugees might process things the way they do, the choices they make. It can be difficult to understand, but it's that kind of trade-off of personal choice versus a guarantee that things will be provided for them. So once a refugee flees into another country, they begin what's called the refugee vetting process, or the overseas screening process. We've heard a lot about this over the past handful of years, but the first step is that a refugee presents themselves to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, either through a US embassy or at a camp, and they begin that process of applying to be a refugee. It begins with an application that goes through everything from basic biographical information, their name, their date of birth, their address that they lived at previously, where their family members are, what their education history is. And it includes everything up to, why did you flee your home? What caused you to flee? The final question on that application is a narrative of, if you were forced to go home today, what do you believe would happen? So in that moment, refugees are really forced to put pen to paper and write out their worst fears of what has caused them to flee and what they genuinely believe would happen if they had to go back home. After that application is completed, if they meet that initial definition of a refugee and it's deemed that they have a valid fear of persecution based on their membership in one of those groups, their application is then sent on to a resettlement support center. Resettlement support centers are typically funded by a number of different nations. Many of them are funded by the United States, and they conduct the pre-screening of refugees. They create case files and begin the process of determining what the best solution is for that refugee. Each refugee in that initial process is given 3 options. The first option is to wait in the country that they're in until things settle down at home and become safe again and they're able to return home. The second option is that refugees can resettle into the country that they fled into. Oftentimes they're more culturally similar. So those first 2 options, either going home or settling into a country that they fled into, is typically the first choice that people have. That's their preference. And then that third option is resettlement into a third country. In the past, we've said that 1% of the world's refugees had that opportunity. So 1% of that 26 million. However, with decreasing numbers of refugees being admitted to the United States and other countries around the world, over the past few years, we've seen even less than 1% of the world's refugees have that opportunity to resettle into a third country. For those refugees who are opting to resettle into a third country, then that application process is passed on to, they're conditionally accepted to the United States at that point, and their application process is sent on to US security agencies, who then screen candidates, conducting biographic security checks, starting with interagency checks through Homeland Security, FBI, counterterrorism, specially trained officers, then through the US Citizenship and Immigration Services conduct interviews with refugees. It reviews many of the same questions that were completed on that application of what caused them to, what's causing you to flee your home? What do you think would happen if you had to go home right now? What is, where are your family members? Do you know if they're alive or if they've passed? Where do you know people? Where have you sent money? What have you studied? Who are your connections? All of these are things that those interviews and those security screenings are checking. if at any point in that process, the information from an interview doesn't match with the information on the application, the process stops. If they aren't, the different security checks are unable to get enough information from their sources and from the interviews, the process stops. After interviews, then refugees move into the kind of this recurrent vetting that's a security screening process. Security screens are valid for 6 months. It includes biographic investigations, identity investigations, biometric checks, photograph screenings, and other checks by US domestic and international intelligence agencies. For some refugees from countries such as Iraq and Syria, they go through an additional process on top of that called the Security Advisory Opinion process, which is very much like it sounds. It takes the information that's been presented and a group of individuals provide their opinion on whether or not this person is a risk to the United States. That screening process, like I said, is valid for 6 months. Simultaneously, the refugees are going through medical screening processes, which really just look at checking if refugees have any highly communicable diseases that would prevent them from entering the United States. If they have something like tuberculosis, they would be provided treatment and then cleared once they are no longer contagious. So that medical screening is also only valid for 6 months. So many refugees get caught in this cycle of security screening is valid, but the medical screening is not. And that can take many years. This whole process up until from stage 1 to stage 5, many times you'll hear it takes 18 months at most, but the reality is that for many refugees, it can take years and years. There are refugees who spend 5, 10, 15, 20 years in camps waiting to be able to be resettled, waiting for this process to all of the stars to align, so to speak, for them to be able to come to the United States. However, it does happen that these things all line up, and when they do, then refugees are scheduled to attend a cultural orientation class. That initial cultural orientation class that happens overseas is very much focused on what the process of traveling to the United States will be like and what to expect when they arrive in the United States. For refugees, that varies based on where they're coming from. For refugees from perhaps Karen State in Burma, refugees coming out of Thailand that have been spending their time in camps in Thailand, that overseas cultural orientation includes things like, this is how you turn on a faucet, and this is how you work a stove. They may not be as familiar with running water and electricity, and so it covers more of those, what we might think of as basics, in addition to the process of coming to the United States. For refugees coming out of places in the Middle East, many of those orientations might be a half-day class that's optional compared to those camps in Thailand. Oftentimes it's a week-long full-day classes. They attend that class, and then they are given scheduled for travel to the United States through an organization called the International Organization for Migration. That organization schedules the travel and initiates an interest-free travel loan for refugees that pays for the cost of the flights. Refugees, once they arrive in the United States, are expected to begin paying back that loan within 6 months of arrival. When they land in the United States, organizations like Catherine McAuley Center, these local resettlement sites, then meet refugees at the airport and begin the process of resettling that refugee. While all of that is happening overseas, domestically, we are beginning the process of preparing for refugees and assigning them to the local sites. So once a refugee has been conditionally accepted, so that it would be that step 3, refugees are then, their information is then sent to the 9 national resettlement agencies who gather every week and allocate the different cases across the country to those over 200 local resettlement sites. So preference is always given for people to reunite with family or friends. It makes it easier to enter into a new community when you have that built-in support system. And so refugees are given the choice of who they would want to reunite with if they're given that opportunity. And that's taken into consideration when cases are allocated to different sites. Many of the cases that we see here in Cedar Rapids are family or friends reuniting, but they're not all. And so at that weekly meeting, the National Resettlement Agencies take into consideration things like the language ability in local offices. They take into consideration the cost of living, the education systems, the partnerships with perhaps medical offices for refugees who have high medical needs. And so all of those things are considered when a refugee is assigned to a different site. Once a refugee is assigned to a site at our local office, so we would receive in the resettlement program the case's information. At that point, we reach out to the family or friend if they have one to make sure that they have that they still live in the area, that they have the ability to provide support, and we begin the process of preparing for that refugee to arrive. So this is a map that just shows you where refugees are being resettled, where those local resettlement sites are. They are around the country. And each different colored dot on that represents one of the different 9 national resettlement agencies. So you'll see Cedar Rapids is blue. We are an affiliate of the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, or USCRI. And so that's who we work closely with to make sure that we're providing adequate services and that we're able to resettle the people that are assigned to our office. The process of resettlement is what we call the Reception and Placement Program. It's a 90-day program really aimed at providing the foundation for refugees' life in the United States. It's a very much a fire hose of information and a fire hose of appointments happening very quickly to get people settled. So we start by, even before someone arrives, we set up the apartment. We help make sure that they have all of the household goods that they need to start life in the United States. We meet people at the airport, visit them within 24 hours at their home, and begin things like school enrollment, connecting with the ABE program for adult basic education for English learning. We provide an expanded cultural orientation from that overseas orientation that was provided, and talk to people about what health and hygiene is, what are US laws that they'll need to know and understand, what is kind of the experience that they'll have in entering into the new community, what are school expectations and norms, all of that. We help refugees apply for public assistance benefits that they're eligible for, connect them with medical appointments, apply for documents, get their social security card, all of that. It really is just things that aim at creating that foundation for life. Like I said, it's a 90-day process, so everything moves very quickly. And it's a stressful time for everybody. And so we receive some funding to be able to help pay for their apartment or pay for some of their needs in then those initial days while they start looking to find work. Like I said, refugees are expected to start paying that travel loan within 6 months. And so a lot of what we do is really aimed at very quick self-sufficiency and how can we get people on their feet quickly. And then at CMC, we've expanded our programs beyond that reception and placement program for that first 90 days to provide a lot of wraparound services, to be able to connect people with the support that they need to be more successful than just being able to pay their bills. So we have employment services, including a matching grant program that's a federal program that provides an alternative to public cash assistance, with the expectation that refugees in that program are working and financially self-sufficient within 120 to 180 days. So it's a very much a fast-tracked program trying to get people jobs very quickly. But we provide additional employment services as well to folks to make sure that they're able to meet their basic needs, but also work towards a career and identifying what their career goals are and what kind of additional training or support is needed to get to that point. We also provide a program called Preferred Communities, which is a very intensive case management program for 6 months to a year. Typically, we see single parents, people with high medical needs in that program. However, with COVID and the derecho, we've seen a number of children that we've enrolled in that program lately, trying to connect them with the support that they need and connect them with the supports that are available within the local community and the schools to help them kind of enter into the US school system as well. So we also provide resource navigation, which is a very broad program to any refugee or immigrant in the United States in our community who just needs help making those connections. I like to think of resource navigation as building bridges, both between our refugees and immigrants and service providers. And it's a two-way street. We help service providers understand how they can better work with refugees and immigrants and help our clients understand how to access those services. For many people, just making a phone call, just saying, hey, call the health center and they'll set you up with an appointment and take it from there. They just need a little bit additional support because everything is so different in the United States. If you think about the medical systems and our immigration systems and our benefit systems are just very complicated and can be difficult to understand. So our resource navigator helps to make those connections and helps people really work through what they need to be successful. We also provide a child care business development program that trains refugees and immigrants how to open in-home child care centers. That program, we know that it really solves two problems. So we know that for parents, if you're a parent, dropping your child off to daycare is stressful in and of itself, leaving your child with someone that's not you. And then if you add on the immigrant experience that dropping off a child to someone who you may not share a language with and may not feed your child the same types of food you're used to feeding your child and may have different child rearing practices, these all add additional challenges and often prevent people from going to work when they otherwise might be interested or able to. So the Child Care Business Development Program opens up and provides for creating culturally appropriate childcare slots within our community and provides an income stream for individuals who choose to open in-home childcare centers. Our last area is healthcare navigation, which, like I said, the healthcare system, insurance, providers, specialists is very confusing to me. And I was born and raised in the United States. I can't fathom being someone who's come from a very different experience of medical systems. And so it helps people navigate medical systems. Our healthcare provider has talked about how our healthcare navigator has talked about how some of our refugees have experienced things like, back home, they may go to a doctor and the doctor just looks at them and can tell what's wrong. So coming to the United States and having to tell your doctor, oh, my back hurts and my legs got a little tingling, and I get these headaches a lot, is a different experience because they're not used to having to tell people. There's that, we range from that expectation that doctors can just tell what's wrong up to people who think that American medicine has been so glamorized around the world that we expect that some of our clients expect that everything will be better and that the doctors will be able to make all of their ailments just go away. So we have a wide range of expectations and beliefs that are coming prior to people coming here. So I do want to highlight that with all of the services that we provide in refugee and immigrant services, there are a lot of times where we partner and pair with ABE and opportunities to get connected. So Anne, do you want to
Yeah, I was unmuting. And I do want to say, back after we watched the poem, which is a killer every time I watch it, and wow, how powerful. Sarah talked about trust, and I think as we look at what the resettlement program does in those first 90 days is helping build the trust back with people and giving them a sense of, hey, there's a community organization that I know I can trust, that I can go to, but then it bleeds totally into what you're doing as tutors. You're helping build some trust in a community that they don't know anything about, or a culture that they're not sure of. So this is the humongous part of what you guys do as volunteers for us, is help us continue building that trust with people who so desperately need it. I think the refugee, well, not even think, I know, education plugs in with the refugee and immigrant services really nicely. Part of the resettlement process, we get people up and running with English classes as fast as we can. Employment services, we've got several things in the hopper for helping with tutoring for people going through CNA programs. So if you've got any medical background, we'd love to hear about that. We'd love to have you do that. Preferred communities, we've plugged in with doing some English classes for some of the kids that are coming to an after-school program. We've got a partnership with Cedar Rapids School District that we're starting, and getting high school kids some more tutoring. So also do it for the children. If you could do some more tutoring with kids, we would love that. So we've got that. I mean, there's just resource navigation. You guys know, if your students have a problem, we will send them to Abby, our resource navigator. She's going to be able to help people plug into the resources they need. Childcare, business development, we do daycare English with them, with those women, mostly women who come through there. So healthcare navigation, Bonnie, our healthcare navigator, is going to be helping with some of the bigger cultural orientation classes we've got going. So we all work really nicely together to get that trust foundation going as much as we can, and you guys are integral to that for sure. So thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, Sarah, take it away.
Absolutely. So the last thing I always like to end with, given all that we've talked about, when we think about culture and we talk about people are coming from a different culture and entering into a new culture here, a lot of times we think of those surface issues like food, dress, the language, literature, celebrations, games people play, those things about culture that are easy to see. However, I always like to quote the Talmud here, that we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And that really gets at those unspoken parts of culture, the deep culture, the unconscious part of culture, things that talk about what does body language mean? I heard very early in my career, an Iraqi gentleman say that, in the United States, you're taught that you have to remain open, and that's how people know that you're listening and paying attention. However, in Iraqi culture, it's in the culture that he came from, it's respectful to cross your arms, because that's a sign that you're not distracted with other things, and you're not focusing on other things, but your arms are crossed, and so you're sitting at attention. Whereas for US culture, for many of us, that would be a sign that someone's disengaged. So just those little things that we don't necessarily realize, because that's that part of unconscious culture. It includes things from what does modesty mean, how are problems solved, what's determined clean and unclean, who can you trust, what is logical, what is valid. All of these things speak to culture and what people are entering into the US with. And we have it. And so it's important to recognize our own culture, as well as recognize the culture of the people that we're working with and engaging with. So with that, I will open it up to questions. I'm shocked that we got through all of this so quickly. So that being said, if I forgot anything, please feel free to ask questions.